We begin with Karen Armstrong. She had a wish for a better world. Her proposal? The Charter for Compassion, which you have in your handouts. Why compassion? Karen Armstrong is a theologian and historian of world religions. She knows that between the years about 900 and 200 before the Common Era, in a period known as the Axial Age, the world's core religious traditions developed, making civilization possible through spiritual change that turned people away from tribalism and violence toward cooperation and harmony. She knows that a common element of all the world's religions is compassion, expressed in the Golden Rule. From ancient Egypt, attributed to the goddess Ma'at, that which you hate to be done to you, do not do to another. From ancient China, words of the great teacher Kongzi, otherwise known as Confucius. Never do to others what you would not like them to do to you. From ancient Israel, words of the Torah. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Very words were later quoted by Jesus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus added a real zinger. Love your enemies. Later, the Prophet Muhammad began every single surah of the Quran with the words, "In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful." And in the Hadith he says, "None of you truly believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself." So, with all that wisdom and teaching of compassion, when we look at our history and at our present world, we have to ask, what went wrong? And is it possible to work toward fixing it? To work toward healing our world? Two basic interrelated things have gone wrong. First, the old brain, the pre-axial age mind, is still there. Second, those wonderful religious traditions are easily misunderstood and perverted. The old brain is characterized by the 4 F's, which we'll get to. The way toward healing is through the 4 immeasurables, which we'll also get to. Religious traditions are misunderstood and perverted by idolatry and blasphemy, and the way toward healing is the way of wisdom. The old brain, otherwise known as the reptilian brain, is characterized by the 4 F's, survival-oriented traits: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction. Note, turtles lumber out of the pond, lay their eggs, and then forget about them. They are not caring creatures. Those 4 F's are rooted in a bigger F, fear. And we know what happens if you poke at someone dominated by fear. The biggest F, fury. So the old brain naturally skids toward hatred and violence. How can the old brain's power be overcome? Traditions of religion and wisdom have shown a way to overcome the old brain. For instance, the Buddha. He challenges us to contemplate and practice the four immeasurables: Maitri, loving kindness, benevolence; Karuna, compassionate action; Mudita, appreciative joy in the success of others; Upeksha, non-attachment, equanimity. We will return to these four immeasurables often during our series. These replace fear of others with respect, love, and compassion. So how can we fix that? The negative power of the old brain can be overcome by, for instance, the four immeasurables, which derive from a religious tradition. But one of the big things that went wrong, remember, is misunderstanding religious traditions. So, how are religious traditions misunderstood in such a serious way? And the inverse, how should religious traditions, for instance, your own tradition, be understood in order to attain wisdom? To get at that complex issue, let me use a deceptively simple analogy. Two parallel relationships, like a proportion. Let's say wisdom is to misunderstanding and idolatry, just as insight is to information. Now, what's important in these relationships is how language works, what logic is at play, and what truth means. So, look at how this works in information. Like a newspaper headline. Language is stating a fact. Logic, a factual claim that requires grounding in evidence. Truth is certainty based on the evidence, confidence that this actually happened. So logically, we test the claim against evidence. So here's the evidence. What do you think? Conclusion? Fake news. Now let's look at how language, logic, and truth work in insight. Here's an insight. The gentlest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world. That's from the Tao Te Ching, poem 43. Language is poetic and evocative. It's the language of myth. Logic is metaphor and paradox. By the logic of metaphor, you see, we can speak of what is beyond our ordinary knowledge in terms that are ordinary and familiar, like, in this case, water. Truth is ever-growing enlightenment. So, what happens if you treat a religious tradition as information? In the Bible, for instance, the first creation story in Genesis, God created the world in 6 days. Language appears to be stating a fact. End of story, case closed. The logic? It's a factual claim requiring grounds. So, what are the grounds? Truth. It's certainty based on evidence. But where is the evidence? A factual claim cannot be self-validating, at least not rationally. So, you have to take it on faith. But then what happens? Religious believers risk skidding into idolatry, deifying what is less than divine by giving a particular claim absolute and unquestionable validity. They risk skidding into blasphemy, that is, treating the divine as less than divine, by regarding a revelation of divine insight as if it's a newspaper. But more can happen, for that appeal to blind faith draws a circle, a rampart. Only believers can be in. Otherwise, you're out, condemned. Talk about otherizing. It can get worse. Let's say there's a differing claim. That raises defense mechanisms. Fear raises its ugly head, and soon fury is let loose. So a misunderstood religion unleashes the worst that the old brain could perpetrate. Reptilian brain rises again and takes over. But if you treat a religious tradition as a way to insight, what happens? Language is poetic, evocative, the language of myth. Such language opens the mind and invites deeper questioning. Logic is metaphor and paradox, enabling us to rise beyond the ordinary and familiar, like a launch pad. Truth is ever-growing enlightenment, a spiritual quest big as the universe. In that growing enlightenment, and as a resistance movement to fury and violence, ancient sages understood that the 4 F's recede, spiritual transformation and deepening occur. The 4 immeasurables can become second nature, and the golden rule the habit of life. It was between the years 900 and 200 before the Common Era that this realization occurred, a time known as the Axial Age. But there is more, especially in our time. For we live in a world shared by people of many religious traditions. And if we see our traditions as a way to insight, and others do too, something powerful changes. People of the world's religious traditions can then relate to each other as spokes of a universal wheel, each reaching to the center of wisdom in a unique and complementary way. Even more, it is possible for people to understand and appreciate each other center to center in one interconnected web, bound together by compassion. And so now, in our critical time, we may be at a tipping point to decide the future between the power of the old brain and its fury and the power of compassion, binding together the interconnected web of all existence. Opting for the old brain could lead us to a new dark age. Opting for compassion can possibly lead us to a renewed axial age. Here, we seek compassion.